you know, mathematical, statistical, that sort of thing. I'm fond of quoting my heroine, Mae West. You know, Mae West is the great American comedian. She said, "I was Snow White, but I drifted." And that's how I feel I've moved, and I think it'll come through this afternoon. I think the way we should think about the economy and its history is a combination of the social sciences with their mathematical models and whatever, and the humanities. The how much question and the what kind question combined. By the way, I have a speech defect, as you'll hear. You can either grow accustomed to it or run screaming from the room. It's your choice. It's, break down crying. So it's on the edge between the social sciences and the humanities. My current thinking is. So the theme of these talks is having to do with crisis. But of course, I'm an economist, as I've admitted, so I don't think of the current situation as one of crisis. In fact, on the contrary, as I'm going to argue to you this afternoon, we are in the greatest, fastest period of economic growth in the history of the world. And the wretched of the earth are being rapidly relieved in this change that's overcome us. That is the big story of the economy. Is not the 2008 recession, as unpleasant as it is. I lost $200,000 on my mother's apartment. So, you know, feel good. As unpleasant as that, so what we're now calling the Great Recession was, it's not the big story. The big story is that China and India, China since 1978, India since 1991, are growing in income in an enriching way that doesn't all go to the very rich, although I was just in India for the first time and I saw a lot of examples of the very rich, which is upraising the poorest of the world. 40% of the world's population is in China or India. And if we keep our wits about us, this period of very fast economic growth will continue. Now, this is contrary to what probably 3/4 of the audience fervently believes. 3/4 of the audience probably believes that neoliberalism, as it's come to be called, is just terrible, and that globalization is worse. That the poor in the United States, or for that matter in the world, have been made worse off by the machinations of the corporations, McDonald's, Walmart, and so forth. But I think you're wrong. And I want to gently lead you to at least having some doubts that this pessimistic story that you tell might not be entirely correct. My favorite quotation in this connection is from Oliver Cromwell. In his last letter to to the presbyters of the Scottish Church before he invaded Scotland. Oliver was a very good general, so if he invaded you, you were in trouble. And he said, he's trying to persuade them to behave themselves. And he said, consider, this is a somewhat odd expression, I admit, but consider in the bowels of Christ that you may be mistaken. And he was a Puritan, a Christian. So this in the bowels of Christ business means bow, means considering Christ's sacrifice. Let's get serious about this. Consider that you might be mistaken, is all I ask of you. And we'll have lots of time for some back and forth after I've gently led you to this this optimistic conclusion. Now, one fact that it's quite important that you realize, that you admit, that you embrace, that you engrave on your heart and come to love. One fact of economic history is the following. If we start over here at the coming of Homo sapiens to Africa, in Africa, we're all African here, by the way. And if we chart income per head in real terms, in real Lincoln, Nebraska prices, this has been specially done for your benefit, translated into Lincoln prices. To heck with London or New York prices, we're going to do Lincoln prices here. $3 a day, and my finger has a remarkable scientific quality that I can do scientific charts very accurately. The finger has the data in it. And we're going to go along since 200,000 BCE, the rough time of the first mitochondrial Eve and her good friend Adam. And we're going to march through history. And we're going to find from my finger, the finger contains it, that income per head was roughly, income including all things you could make or find or trade or do anything, all your consumption amounted to, in modern prices, $3 a day. $3 a day. For the price of a loaf of bread, you had to cover all your expenditures. Your housing, your clothing, whatever. Our ancestors, to put it another way, back then at least, were unspeakably poor. You can talk about the charms of the hunter-gatherer life, but I don't think the hunter-gatherers would think they were so charming by comparison with a nice philosophical, historical talk in this marvelous auditorium on a Thursday afternoon. They had a hard life. So it goes at $3 a day, and it stays at $3 a day. The reason it stays at $3 a day is the logic of Malthus, the Malthusian logic, which was adopted by Darwin in his brutal but correct theory of the origin of species, as when a niche gets profitable, the plants or animals rush into it until it's no longer profitable. It's the most fundamental way of economic thinking. We call it in economics entry and exit, but Darwin says in his autobiography that he got the idea from Malthus, right? And the problem is that if, I don't know, let's take the northwestern United States with all those salmon, right? Well, you just go down to the Columbia and you put your hand in and grab a salmon and eat it. Very easy to feed yourself. originally in Washington, but then population grows, doesn't it? The children are well fed with protein. The women are more fertile because they eat well. So more people, more children survive infancy and grow up to be strong and have more kids, and you get a big increase in the population of the northwestern First Nations. And it keeps happening until their numbers are such that the gain from the abundance of salmon is exhausted by what economists call, this will ring bells if you've had an economics course, diminishing returns. People are kept down at $3 a day. We're going to make the flag the present. We're going to go along at $3 a day. $3 a day, we have the Ice Age, comes and goes. Here it's about, let's see, the last Ice Age, the so-called, called in the United States the Wisconsinian, comes and goes, gradually goes. And then it's what's known as the Holocene. We invent agriculture. Oh, that's nice. In 9 different parts of the world. Not, as I was told in my childhood, in the Near East, and that's the beginning of Western civilization. It's a very peculiar terminology, but that's what we were taught. It's this Eurocentric story of Middle Eastern development of wheat, which then makes for the glorious United States of America. But agriculture, though it's invented all over the place, it's invented in what became the Mayan lands, it's invented in Peru, the domestication of the potato. It's invented actually in North America, the Mississippian culture, and independent domestication. It's invented in New Guinea, all by itself, with no influences from the ancient Near East. It's embedded in sub-Saharan Africa. It's embedded all over the place. A somewhat peculiar event. I'd like some archaeologists to explain it to me. But as an economist, I know it didn't make people any better off. Now, for another reason. Not only would there be more people coming into the niche of agriculture, getting larger populations, which by diminishing returns drives us back to subsistence, which is $3 a day or thereabouts, but also because of property. In this sense, Rousseau was correct. Property in this case is an original theft. Property is theft. It was later declared. And in the sense that people with swords can easily expropriate farmers tied down to the land. They can't expropriate herders who can run off with their herds. They can't exploit hunter-gatherers who can say, see you around, I'm going to go hunt and gather somewhere else. But farmers, stuck where they are really easy to tax and to charge rents to. So the average person, the descendants of everyone here, I look around, I look for the descendants of kings of Africa or Asia or Europe. I don't see any here. Are there any? Any royal families represented in this audience? I doubt it. Certainly in my case, not. And so it goes along back to $3 a day, even after the agricultural revolution. Now, I'm not saying the agricultural revolution was a bad thing. On the contrary, it made possible cities. And cities made, as the very word implies, civilization. We learned to write, we learned to read, we learned lots of things, and we became more than we could have been if we had just stayed with hunter-gathering. But anyway, here we are. Now we're at about 1800. And in Western Europe it starts. It starts a little bit earlier in Northwestern Europe, but not much earlier, in Holland. Holland is the first modern economy. And it spreads by the end, by say 1700, it started to spread to England. And then here's what happens to income per head. Now watch, this is very important from a scientific point of view. You have to hear it too. Income per head in the countries that do it, that have what I call the great enrichment, goes up like this. The is important. It's a hockey stick. That's the handle, this is the blade. In the world as a whole, even including very poor countries now, income per head, which was once something like $3 a day, is now about $30 a day. $30 a day is about the income of present-day Brazil per person. And although Brazil, a country I know a bit and love, is a poor country, it's much better off than its ancestors were. So what's the story here? Is this a story of exploitation, of stealing from the working class or the third world? Is it a story of capital accumulation, the sort that the blessed Adam Smith brought into economics and that Marx, as a follower of Adam Smith, believed? And my answer in volume 2 of these 3 is no, it's not. What made the modern world was ideas. The proximate cause of the modern world is ideas like the steam engine, the computer, or this institution we have around us, the modern research university, the first example of which was von Humboldt's invention of the University of Berlin in 1810. It's a remarkable idea instantiated in this campus. So it's ideas is the proximate cause, because it's not, here's the key point, here's the key economic point. This is why my friends in economics, my colleagues, are wrong. My friends on the right, my friends on the left. I have friends everywhere. Although I insult them all the time. The capital accumulation did not make the modern world. Now you look around, you say, what's she talking about? She's nuts. Look at this amphitheater. Look at all the buildings. You have, by the way, a very good capital stock, physical capital stock in this campus, I must say. By comparison with lots of other universities, you have very nice buildings. Don't complain. You're in very good shape, physically speaking. But that's not what makes people in Nebraska rich. It's not the physical capital or the land. It's the ideas that make the physical capital and the land profitable and productive. It's the idea of irrigation. Everyone who flies over Nebraska knows that eventually you get these circular fields because that's how they irrigate it with pumped water from the ground. The idea of hybrid corn, the idea of an open market for agricultural products. Not to say that Nebraska is entirely agricultural. I lived for 19 years in Iowa, and although it's only discovered every 4 years by the journalists from the New York Times that Iowa is not a bunch of hicks on their farms, the same is true of Nebraska. Most of what Nebraskans do is outside of farming, because farming has become so very productive, but that's my point. The over there is a result of astonishing increases in output per man in these countries like the United States or Botswana or Taiwan that have embraced what I call market-tested betterment. To put it another way, this is more technical from the economic point of view, just those, the others don't need to pay attention, but the economists here. The problem is that a marginal product of capital that just sat there, a marginal product curve of capital that just sat there, and wasn't constantly being pushed out by innovation, would drive the opportunity cost of, well, would drive the marginal product of investment down to zero in a generation. That's what Keynes said, and he was right. Piling brick on brick by itself is not a long-term formula for, it's a formula for modest increases, and again, Adam Smith is the guide here. He felt that the Highlands of Scotland, if the Highlanders would only behave themselves and start wearing pants or something, could equal what Holland was at the time in the 1700s. But that would be a doubling or a tripling of income, not an increase of a factor of 30, or if you properly measure the quality of the improved quality of goods, a factor of more like a 100. That's not 100%, dears. That's a factor of 100. If it's a factor of 100 to do the 5th grade arithmetic, it's 9,900% improvement over the original, the base of 1800. If it's only a factor of 30, then it's still 2,900%. So my theme here is an optimistic one, not a pessimistic one. We are not in crisis. 2008 was not the final crisis of capitalism. I keep saying to, Jack Amarillo and other friends like that, I say, Jack, Jack is an old friend of mine, say, Jack, you Marxists were saying that about the crisis of 1857, that it was the final crisis of capitalism. And then the crisis of 1873, the crisis of 1896, and the crisis of, one crisis after another. Now I have to admit that in the 1930s, it really looked like this was the final crisis of capitalism. And I'm sure that if I had grown up in that era, I would have been a communist. But I didn't. I was born in 1942. And I've seen the fall of the idea that capital accumulation is what drives the modern world. Foreign aid, when I was a kid, was the great salvation. The rich world, the West or the North, or First World, however you want to describe it, would give money to the Third World, the poor people, the South, and then they would have capital stock just like ours. They'd have the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and they'd be just as rich as we are. But that's not what happened. Capital accumulation didn't work. What worked was liberating people. I speak again of China and then India. But let me go back to my 17th and 18th century. My claim is that the proximate ideas, the steam engines and universities and so on, were themselves the result of an astonishing increase in the rate of innovation. Frenetic, pazzo, crazy, loco increase after 1800. And that in turn came, I would argue, from a new egalitarianism that springs up, it's not a very historical phrase to use, but originates in northwestern Europe. An egalitarianism that, I don't want to exaggerate it, that doesn't mean that everyone is equal, but it does mean that ordinary people were given greater dignity than they had before. Ordinary people in most societies, most agricultural societies, not in hunter-gatherers, but in most agricultural societies, had no dignity at all. The dignified people, the people of honor, were the rich people, or the priests, the people who ran the, who owned the land or ran the temples. They were dignified. The other people were just workers, your ancestors and mine. So, here's what I'm saying. This will please the 3/4 of you who doubt that capitalism is such a wonderful thing. The egalitarianism that you and I love, we both love this. The equality in dignity of human beings was what made for innovation. Now, I'm not saying what Max Weber said. Max Weber said that the psychology of people changed. And the kind of one version of this is entrepreneurial talk, where you say, well, once we were very slothful and weren't entrepreneurs, and then these Northwestern Europeans, for some reason, started to get entrepreneurial, maybe because they were anxious as Calvinists about their place in salvation, and blah, 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 blah. No, Max Weber has a very attractive theory, and his great book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but it's wrong. It's been shown over and over and over again to be wrong. People love Max Weber's book, and so it kind of rises from the dead all the time. I'd like to put a stake through its heart and just kill it off. It's bad theology, it's bad economic history, it's bad economics, it's all wrong. But what's right about it, except that, it's all wrong, is, and it's very odd that Max Weber, one of the great founders of sociology, didn't recognize this, that it's the sociological change in the position of inventors and merchants, people having a go, people taking chances on a new hairdressing salon or a new electric motor. It was a change in the dignity of those people and the liberty of those people, both those two things, dignity I've told you about, and the legal ability to start a factory wherever you want and to carry on with it. So it's those two. Look, here's my point then, too. Ingenuity is a human characteristic. Creativity is a human characteristic. Its percentage, the percentage of people who are truly creative, is probably, I don't know, 10 or 15%. And that doesn't mean that the people who are not are a bunch of jerks. They're good too, but they do something else than innovation. And that's worth doing. You got to keep we got to keep the heat on. We got to keep the plant going somehow. So that's what they do. But the people who invent new methods of heating, or new methods of eating for that matter, they've always been there. Human beings have always been ingenious and keep inventing new stuff since the Holocene, or really since Africa, or in Africa itself. But they weren't rewarded for it. They were often crushed and attacked for it. They were disturbing the guilds. It's not, I praise the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie, when it gets hold of politics, can stop innovation and tries to all the time. I once was invited in Gothenburg, which is the port of Sweden, the main port of Sweden, to talk to the owner of the largest ferry company in Northern Europe, because he wanted to find out from me. He knew that I was an economic historian, and he thought maybe he could get some expert advice on me for him to stop innovating. That's what he said. I'm tired of innovating. I have to run fast to stay at the same place. This is exhausting me. I'm tired. I'm an old man. I want to stop innovating. Can you tell me how? And I said, sir, I'm sorry. You're our servant. If you stop innovating, your ferry company, your shipping company, will instantly be competed against by some ferry company in Estonia or something, and you'll lose all your fleet, and you'll become impoverished. No, I'm sorry. You have to keep at it. That's what happened. The environment, not just competitive, but also cooperative in a very interesting way. The environment for innovation, the environment for betterment, radically improved in places like Holland and England, and then in the North American colonies of England, and then in Belgium, and then in France, and then in Germany, and blah, 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 down to the present. And that's the source of the... It's not capital accumulation. That's why I don't like the word capitalism, which was not actually coined by Marx. Marx didn't use the word capitalism in Das Kapital, but he used the word capitalist quite freely, so we can go with the idea that it was a Marxist word, but in fact it was embraced by other people, and we use because both the economists of the right, the bourgeois economists, and the economists of the left, the Marxists, both thought that capital accumulation was what made the modern world. That was the dynamism of the bourgeoisie, was amassing capitalism. I got various theories about why they got so misled, but we can go into those later. So, my way of talking about this is a radical change from the way my economist colleagues, left or right, talk about it. It's not capital accumulation, it's innovation. It's the creativity of the human mind released. Released by respect and liberty, honor and liberty, dignity and liberty for ordinary people. And then that 10 or 15% that's unusually creative is allowed to do it. And you get this simply astonishing series of inventions. Look around. This wood, nice oak floor here, would have been very expensive in the 18th century before the invention of the circular saw, powered perhaps not by, in the first instance, by a steam power, but by a water mill. Circular saw, bzzz. And then shortly thereafter, 30 or 40 years after, they invented the band saw. This time it frequently was steam powered because it needed more muscle. The band saw, wood could be made much quicker than in the old days. That is to say, cheaper. Cheap, 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 cheap. Wood became cheap. So you have this wood, here it is. Is that carpet? That's carpet. This carpeting is impossible to make in the 18th century. It's very attractive, I guess you might say. But this is, I believe, I think I'm right about this, this piece of carpet is seamless. It goes from there to there. It's just one piece of cloth generated by a great big machine that makes cloth, weaves cloth. Steel is all over the place here. Steel in the cheap steel. Steel was once used only for the swords of the aristocrats and their armor if they were very rich. Steel, you can make in small amounts. Steel is iron with a small amount of carbon, but a controlled small amount of carbon in it. And then Henry Bessemer in 1854 thought, it was kind of a boyish scheme, so I'd like to talk about it. He thought, let's see what happen if you boil iron, pig iron, and then blow air through it. And a very satisfying explosion took place. We've seen perhaps films of a Bessemer converter where pig iron is made into steel, or at least it's made into iron to which pure iron to which you can add a little bit of carbon, then you get steel. You make cheap steel, reinforced concrete, combines a Roman technology of cement. I think these walls probably behind them are made of reinforced concrete. Most modern buildings are. And it's got this cheap steel inside it. And on and on and on. Your clothing is vastly cheaper in labor power than it was even in 1900. So what's happened is that although in advanced economies like the United States, we can't expect to grow at the rates like China or Japan, but in fact, in real terms, the poor of the United States have gotten better off in the last 30 years. Now you'll hear a lot of talk to the contrary about that. If you watch MSNBC, as I do compulsively, you'll get all the news about how average wages have flatlined, that the rich have gotten richer, and the poor are getting poorer, and that's just nonsense. Anyone here who's older than an undergraduate, or even a graduate student, knows, if they think about it, that the quality of goods that even poor people in the United States have access to has increased, and the goods they have access to has increased. Look, when I was an associate professor at the University of Chicago in 1975 and bought our first house, it didn't have air conditioning, and I didn't have air conditioning in the house in 1975. Now, even quite poor people in the United States, often, not always, have air conditioning in their houses. In the average condition of the bottom 10% of the American income distribution is about what I grew up with in a middle-class household. Me, personally. Tony was born in 1942. My father was a professor, so it's kind of upper middle class, right? Quite prosperous. Yet, poor people have access to better and more goods and services than we did in 1950. So it's not true that the poor have gotten poorer, and it's certainly not true internationally. It's not true that the cause of this improvement is exploitation of one class or one region by another. That's not so. It's not so. It's not so that we're in crisis. No, we're not in crisis. Stop talking about crisis. The environmental problems we have are two-sided. One is being taken care of because we're getting richer. Rich countries are very concerned about their environment and they do things about it. Indeed, China has, remarkably, an environmental movement, a vigorous environmental movement, at a stage of industrialization at which England and the United States and other countries like that didn't pay attention to smoke at all. When we used to go from St. Joseph, Michigan around the lake to Chicago back in the late 40s, early 50s, in my grandparents' car, we'd have to go through Gary because there was no interstate. And my grandparents would always point to the steel mills belching smoke and say, isn't that wonderful? Because in 1950, 1951 or 1950, it was wonderful because these people had been through the Great Depression when the mills had been silent and no smoke had been coming out of them. So things have gotten better. They bid fair to keep getting better. We're not, and let me do that in one, drop the other shoe on the environment problem. There is a part of the environment problem that we can't do anything about and is something of a disaster. It's not capitalism that caused it. It's modern transportation, which you could attribute to capitalism if you want. But our enrichment means we can move around, which means that we're no longer in separate continents, ecologically speaking. It's as though we're back in Pangaea 150 million years ago, when all the land masses on Earth were all one single continent before they started to drift apart. It's been going into sort of a pulse, it's very strange. But anyway, there was one single continent, so the dominant tree was this kind, the dominant predator was this kind, the dominant this, the dominant that. It was very uniform biologically. And that's what's happening again. It's not well, I keep saying it's not the fault of industrialization, but in a sense it is. It's the fault of our enrichment. If we had stayed hunter-gatherers or very impoverished peasants without traveling, if we go back to 1800 or 1700 or 1600, we could stop this killing off of species. But as it is, we can't do anything about it. But so far as air pollution and water pollution is concerned, we're on the case. And the richer we become, the more on the case we are. You remember this crazy business of the ozone layer at the poles disintegrating because of hairspray? Hairspray. You know, I'm a big advocate for hairspray, but, you know, there are limits. I don't want to get skin cancer because of hairspray. And so we outlawed, or we worked together and said, no, we're not going to do that kind of hairspray, let's do another kind. And now the ozone hole is closing. So I'm optimistic, very optimistic. Let me close with a sort of a bizarre piece of optimism, which if I could make a bet on this 100 years hence, I would, but I'm not going to be around in 100 years, alas. Or maybe not, alas. Maybe it's a good thing. Here's the bet. That in 100 years, the intellectual and artistic center of the world will be sub-Saharan Africa. That the universities of Nebraska will be in sub-Saharan Africa. That doesn't mean they'll close down here. We'll still be struggling along, we Europeans or Asians. But sub-Saharan Africans will be the top of the pops. Here's why. Sub-Saharan Africans have unusual genetic variability. I'm not making some crazy racist statement here, this is just a fact, it's a biological fact. Ask any human geneticist this, and they'll say, oh yeah, she's right. Everyone else on the planet, the Asians and the Europeans and everyone, Australians and everyone else, came out of Africa in kind of dribs and drabs. By what's known in genetics as the founder effect, the lines died out. Lines that had existed in sub-Saharan Africa with a larger population died out in the course of the migration. So we outside of Africa are much less genetically variable than those inside Africa. Take as an obvious case, the genetically shortest people in the world are in Africa, the sub-Saharan Africa, the genetically tallest people in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the top end of the distribution is thicker in Africa. To the extent that human abilities are genetic, and I'm not making any crazy statement here either. I mean, there are lots of things that are not genetic. But to the extent they're genetic, a genetic disposition to be good at number theory, or a genetic disposition to be very good at the saxophone, these are thicker in the sub-Saharan African population. So, this is part of my optimism. It's an example of my optimism. When sub-Saharan Africa becomes as rich as the United States, you'll say, oh, what are you talking about? That's never happened. Yes, it is. It's going to happen. When malaria gets controlled and cured, when bad government, when sub-Saharan Africans learn, as they have actually, that bad government is bad for people, when air conditioning gets cheaper, when all kinds of things happen, which will happen, sub-Saharan Africa, there's no reason genetically or any other reason why sub-Saharan Africa shouldn't be as rich as Nebraska. And when it does, people will go to university, they'll have violin lessons, they'll have access to books on number theory, and out of this will come the Einsteins and the Mozarts, the Tagores, and the other geniuses that right now are herding their father's cattle in East Africa, or are in a slum in South Africa. So the youngest among you will see this, maybe not in sub-Saharan Africa, but you'll see it in the world. The world is getting better. It's getting richer. We can screw it up. We tried to screw it up in 1914 when the Europeans started fighting each other. And the European Civil War lasted essentially until 1989. A nasty business, which wasn't good for anyone. But if we don't screw it up, if we don't quarrel, fight with each other, and if we don't over-regulate this engine of innovation, of human betterment, if we don't tie it up in red tape, with a modern version, which is green tape, excessive environmental regulation, don't do that, we can have a rich world in which every child has an opportunity to have the scope of human life that's represented by this audience. So look forward, dears, with optimism to the future. It's fashionable, it's fun to be pessimistic. I think of Paul Ehrlich, in 1968, wrote a book called The Population Explosion, which said that the battle to feed humanity is over, finished, we can't do it. The world is coming to an end. And Paul Ehrlich is still around. He's a professor at Stanford. And he's still on TV. I'm just amazed by this. Paul Ehrlich made about the worst scientific predictions in modern times. Worse even than the economists not anticipating the Great Recession, or the physicists not anticipating dark matter. Those are both appalling, shameful failures in economics and physics. But by comparison, they look wonderful. Paul Ehrlich's predictions were all wrong. Everything he said was wrong. And yet we so love pessimism. It makes us feel so cool that we're in the know. And those stupid optimists, oh, they're just naive. We know that the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. We know that diminishing returns is hopeless. We know that the environment is going to hell in a handbasket and will never come back from hell. We know. You naive optimists. Oh, well. And I urge you, in the bowels of Christ, to consider that you may be mistaken. Thank you. I should practice my court curtsy. So I'd be glad to
yes, we have time.
Entertain questions. Got a half an hour. Let's do it. Let's talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you say a little more about excessive environmental regulations? What do you think about it?
Yes, can I say more about excessive environmental regulations? Well, what I mean is cutting off our, I don't pretend to be an expert on the XL pipeline, but I guess as far as I can tell, it looks like a good idea to me, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm very suspicious of the oil and gas industry, so don't assume that I'm naive on that front. But you can slow down economic growth by, well, one thing that does slow down economic growth, it's perfectly plain, is our environmental suits that don't all the time have very much merit, but can radically slow down developments of any sort. So I'm inclined to say let's not be so worried about the environment that we are afraid of everything. I mean, here's another way of expressing it. I think that environmentalism is deeply conservative. Now, in the good sense of conservative, it's saying, well, yeah, damn right, good, I'm glad of that. It conserves the environment. But it's also conservative in the sense of not wanting to change anything. And I worry. So I think we should adopt this phrase, green tape, and watch out for it. That's not carte blanche to Peabody Coal to do whatever it feels like. Yeah, back you there.
I have kind of a two-part question.
Go ahead.
One is there a way to sort of square the notion or understand this notion of the poor continually getting better with data that says that the median income is growing, the gap between rich and poor is growing? Is there a way to see both of those things?
Well,
can I ask the second
well,
question?
I'll come back to you. Suppose I answer the first one and then come back to you, and I promise, I swear I will. You have to be quite careful with this. Let's talk about the very poor for a moment. The very poor have actually become better off in the United States in the last 40 years. And the reason is not just the point that I made earlier about improved quality of goods, and that's true, but also because of the Great Society programs that actually made them better off with transfers. So if you correctly measure the poverty rate in the United States, it's fallen dramatically. Now, if your idea of the poverty rate is the bottom 10% or the bottom 5%, well, we're always going to have a bottom 10%. No matter what the distribution of income is, there's always going to be a bottom 10%. As for the flatlining of the median income, kind of the average person, I don't believe that either. Again, because of this improved quality. The consumer price index is not a conspiracy against reason. But they can't adequately measure the improved quality of goods. And they admit it. There was a commission of economists back in the early 90s called the Boskin Commission, after Michael Boskin at Stanford, and they concluded that the increased quality, say, look, improved computers, that's the easiest one, but also improved tires, automobile tires. When I was a kid, we changed, tires would blow out all the time. I'm very good at changing tires. Now, I don't admit this because I want the men to do it, but I can change, I'll just stand there and hand them handkerchiefs to clean their, I want them to do it. But on the other hand, you don't need to do it very much now, because any of the older people here will testify that automobile tires have just gotten so much better. So it's about 1% per year, which doesn't sound like much, but hey, it adds up. So it's not actually flat. That's right. So it's not this dismal story. It's not a wonderful story. I'm not saying that, oh boy, actually things are great for the average person in the United States, and you all on the left, you're all wrong. No, you're partly right. It's slowed down. But it's not the grim news that you hear on MSNBC every night. So that's just a kind of factual correction. Go ahead. What's your second point?
And along with that, I like the notion that in order to innovate, you have to have the freedom to do that.
Yeah,
and I'm
certainly
thinking, do you see how access to information via something like education might be tied to these notions of or
yeah.
might be important to that? How does education sort of, and access to
Well, it's a little tricky, because education can be conservative. The Chinese examination system, for example, which made China the most educated country in the world in, say, 1600, was an examination in classical Chinese poetry, largely, and was not, engineering. It was not honoring engineering. I was just over at your bookstore. I was impressed, as I always am, by the level of mathematical education in what sound like ordinary engineering careers. Hydraulic, people who deal with water, or chemical engineers. That must be simple. They must be simple-minded folk. You just have to go over there and open one of their books, and Fourier's series, it's quite shocking. So that kind of education, that's good, and certainly education in English and history is the things I teach is good. It opens people's minds to other ways of life. It makes them flexible, or it can. Or it can make them into simple-minded ideologues. Look, there was a grammar school revolution in France and England and some other European countries in the 16th and 17th century. More boys, for example, Shakespeare, the girls I didn't care about them, but the boys of middle-class families like Shakespeare went to grammar school, where Shakespeare learned small Latin and less Greek. But the grammar school education was indeed to learn Latin. In Thomas Mann's great book, Buddenbrooks, Hanno learns Latin very well by going to school. But it doesn't do Hanno any good. It doesn't make him into the entrepreneur that his father was. So it's not obvious that flexibility, look, I'm in the business. I'm really in favor of education. The higher, the better, right? So I'm not against education, but I'm kind of warning you that it's not like piling brick on brick. Piling BA on BA doesn't get you economic growth necessarily. You've got to have the ideology squared away. Gramsci is one of my heroes. And he says that ideology is central. And he's right. What people think about each other, the valuation they put on each other is crucial. And if everyone goes to college and learns at college to sneer at the bourgeoisie, you can kill economic growth. So it was in higher education in India for a long time after independence. Yeah?
Yeah, and this actually ties into right about where we are, that you're using Gramsci to make this idea that if ideology is central,
Yeah.
but at the same time a lot of these economic claims you're just asserting as totally inevitable truth. Should there, or is there a move that we should consider kind of the ideological functions that are happening behind economics?
Yeah, sure. And the news I bring is good, right? It's cheerful. That stripping away the ideology of economics, which, you know, I've done a considerable amount of. It's not that I don't think that words are just transparent and that they're just to convey information. And I'm reasonably up to speed on that point. But I don't think the hermeneutics of suspicion is the cat's meow, put it that way. I don't think that constantly worrying about, or not worrying so much, go ahead, feel free to worry, but constantly demeaning whatever's being said or being done by saying, oh yeah, I know, this is your id speaking, or oh yeah, I know, ah yes, it's no accident. We used to say in the Communist Party, it is no accident, comrade, that you speak that way, because you're objectively bourgeois. Well, there's some use to that. You've got to be sophisticated about rhetoric, and I'm all for it. But you can't let it kill off a business-respecting civilization, which is, it's not Babbitt, it's just business-respecting. The whole purpose of these 3 volumes of mine is to convince you all, what I call the clerisy, the artists and the intellectuals, to stop beating up on the bourgeoisie. Yeah?
I'm okay with not beating up on the bourgeoisie, yes. I mean, I am not, but...
I can't hear you.
Okay. I'm worried about this because, not because it's just entertaining to say, here's somebody so far on the right, because I don't hear this often, but it's dangerous. This is dangerous thinking. I mean,
I think so, huh?
Yeah, as somebody who's written about rhetoric, I want you to reflect on your own rhetorical operations.
Yeah.
One, you've set up a very strict binary between pessimism and optimism.
Yeah, well,
And you've affiliated that with pro-capitalism and anti-capitalism,
right.
which is not the case. I can be very optimistic about the future of the world and still hold the position that it requires bringing down the current economic system.
Yeah, but I don't want to bring down the current economic system.
Right, because that's your
and I've
version
given
of
you 3 volumes of reasons
Right.
not to bring it.
Right, but that's your version of optimism.
Yeah, it is.
Right, and you're projecting one particular version of optimism, which takes some careful rhetorical maneuvers. Secondly,
Wait, let me just stop, and then I'll allow you to speak again, just as I did him. I'm not just asserting this. I'm not just sort of right-wing. You know, you call me right-wing. These wing talk, although I indulge in it a great deal, is a little shallow, you'll have to admit. I'm a motherly libertarian. I'm a left libertarian, in fact. Very concerned with the condition of the poor. I'm certainly in favor of free speech and free marijuana and all the rest. But, so I'm not just a conservative, so try to get that out of your head. And I'm not just asserting this stuff. I got a lot of evidence for it, don't I?
I have to, but it requires a certain ignoring of the condition of a lot of people in the world.
What are you talking about?
Well, okay,
Look.
so your narrative history starts from a certain place and it ends at a certain place. You've done a very selective narrative history. I mean, you
Well,
start.
of course I have. It's called science.
It's called rhetoric.
No,
So-
it's also called science, which is the same thing.
But if you start your history from, say, making a colonial story, of
Uh-huh.
history, you come up with a completely different.
No, you
Are the
don't.
Native Americans
I
better
have
off?
given, no,
Are the
no,
Native
no.
Americans better off having the entrance of Euro-Americans into the continent?
Well, it depends on which Native American you're talking about. If you're talking about the ones that died of smallpox, no, I agree with you there. That was, but that's part of this gradual recreation of Pangea that's happening. Disease, European diseases, came to the New World, and the same thing happened in Australia. So that they're not better off, that's for sure. But you know that their ancestors will tell you they're better off than they were when they were free spirits on the Great Plains. Now, you may not believe that, but they'll say it. People who have escaped from traditional agriculture gather together in Los Angeles and say, God, thank God we got out of that. So, look, the colonies, here's one thing that I want you to accept, and here's where we agree. Some people were hurt. Some people are hurt by change. Any change you want to name. Take central planning socialism, which is a change. It has been a catastrophe for tens of millions of people, to the extent of death. And there's no doubt about that. I think you would agree with me. So change is dangerous. It hurts some people. But this change I'm talking about, this enrichment, can you agree with me that the enrichment of the West had nothing to do with imperialism? There's an immense amount of evidence that shows that's so. That doesn't mean it was a good idea for the Indians, or the Indians, either South Asians or the First Nations in North and South America. But it does mean that the enrichment of Europe didn't come from ripping off the rest of the world. It just didn't. The economics there is very plain. The Europeans got rich because they happened to come on this formula of, there you and I completely agree, a formula of equality for ordinary people. We're the people that you and I care about. I don't care about the millionaires. I care about the ordinary people. So harping on imperialism is not going to get us anywhere. Change is disturbing. I agree with you. That's the conservative side of the left. But considering that we're going to get change, let's make it the change that's good, not the change that's bad. The imposition of central planning socialism was very, very bad. We couldn't have known this in 1917. If you and I were having this conversation in 1917, I'd say, well, maybe you're right. It sounds like a great idea. Let's do it. But it didn't work out. Now you.
Yeah, so I kind of follow up on that. I'm not a geneticist by any means, but if we just presumed that your premise that sub-Saharan African populations have a genetic disposition to higher levels of creativity.
I didn't really put it that way. I said they have a higher variance
higher variance that
genetic abilities.
That
so
we think in 100 years may lead to.
Yeah, let's take that as an example.
Sure. So, I mean, presuming that that's true, that would seem to imply that many of these problems that sub-Saharan Africa has experienced would have been displaced to the periphery. That it would have been Asia, and it would have been the United States, and it would have been North America.
What are you talking about? I don't understand your line.
Well, so, I mean, because you're talking about all of the problems that sub-Saharan Africa is facing
now. No,
we're
not going to. Malaria is not going to break out in Germany because sub-Saharan Africa does well.
like air conditioning, for instance, right? Like my whole point is that if sub-Saharan Africa seems to be genetically dispositioned in a certain way,
Yeah.
what sort? I mean, this seems to cut against your earlier point that the economic engine isn't exploitation. It seems to me to prove quite the opposite.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. I'm not completely sure, but I think you've got a zero-sum theory. You got a theory that if sub-Saharan Africans do better, that'll make us worse off. No, it won't. It'll make us better off. We'll have better music. We'll have better mathematics. We'll have better engineering. So, you know, and this is entirely consistent with my story. Because on the whole, poor people in the rest of the world have been made better off by the successes of industrialization. Look, 40 years ago, you could speak of the bottom 4 billion out of 5 billion people on the planet. And it was hopeless. They were in tyrannies, and Latin America was a mess, and everyone was poor, and the communists were doing terrible things, and it was just an awful mess. 4 billion, and it looked hopeless. Now you can still speak of a bottom billion, which is scandalous. We've got to change this. But it's 1 billion out of 7 billion. There's a book by a very good English economist on this called The Bottom Billion. You ought to read it. And it makes a very good case that we got to do something about the bottom billion, but boy is it better than having 4 billion as the bottom. And that's because of the introduction of electricity. Look, the water, purer water, the Millennium Development Goal of achieving a sharp drop in the percentage of the world's population that has a problem with water, a serious problem with water quality, was achieved not in 2015 when it was supposed to be, but in 2010. I want to hear from a woman. Yeah.
I had a question about what you call green tape and excessive environmental regulations, and particularly the Keystone XL pipeline.
Yeah, well,
on one hand,
it's above my pay grade. I don't really know.
On one hand, well, I mean, to contextualize it, on one hand, resistance to the building of the pipeline has been resistance to development or further development of energy avenues that are very, very dirty and release more greenhouse gases into the environment than they would hope to solve the problem. But there's another question, which are questions that immediately have to do with Enlightenment ideals of land and property rights and liberty and all of that. And the XL Energy Corporation is trying to take over people's lands, foreclose on their lands, and exercise eminent domain over their lands in order to build a pipeline to the interests of a private corporation.
If it's using eminent domain, I'm against it. It should buy the land.
But they used it in Texas.
At market prices.
Yeah,
if they
used
don't,
it in Texas.
you and I should go on the picket line together. Because I'm against eminent domain. I think it's a terrible thing, and I think it shouldn't happen. But you'll agree that if people are paid a fair market price for their land, not a monopoly price, so I'm Farmer Brown and I'm right in the pipeline comes up to my property and say, well, no, you got to pay $1 zillion to me if you want to go through my land. Now, I don't want Farmer Brown to exercise monopoly, but on the other hand, I want Farmer Brown to be fairly compensated.
Well, there's kind of...
I didn't know that they were using eminent domain. If they are, they hell will.
They have in Texas, and they're threatening to do so in the Sandhills.
Eminent domain is a terrible thing. So you and I are on the same side of that one.
So
I'm in favor of what we unfortunately call capitalism. I'm in favor of the way the economy works when private property is taken seriously.
So here's a complication to this, which is that the Keystone XL pipeline is caught up in green tape.
Yeah, it is.
For reasons that I was wondering are either worry
Yeah,
or predictive foresight of
Yeah.
possible
That-
possible consequences of environmental damage
yeah,
that would be unmitigatable.
yeah.
We would
There,
never be able to recover the Ogwal aquifer from this disaster. So
I
at what point do we need green tape? That's my question.
don't think, you mean if it's spilled into the aquifer?
Yeah, and it
Well,
will be. I mean,
you know, actually-
pipelines rupture.
Actually,
It's not
because,
that
yeah,
way.
occasionally they do. But there are, well, would you prefer to do it by rail? It's worse. But if, as you say, and I think you're right, there's some worry about this. If the leakage from the pipes not just spills, but if the leakage of methane, let's take gas. Gas is touted as this clean fuel, but of course there's also leakage from the pipes. And methane is a worse greenhouse gas than CO2, much worse, 20 times worse. So I'm with you. I'm with you in doing a cost-benefit study. I'm with you in your economic argument, which is what you're making. Are the benefits and the costs lined up in a way that is to the benefit of ordinary people or poor people? I don't much care about the stockholders of these companies, although bear in mind that the stockholders are us. It's not just a bunch of very rich people who get better off when these things develop. So it's interesting, look, if I had been giving this talk 30 years ago, the complaint from the left would have been, capitalism is corrupting of the human soul. But look what happened in the last 10 years. People on the left have turned to environmentalism as their complaint against what we're unfortunately calling capitalism. And I wonder, because the first complaint from the left is that capitalism was physically immiserizing of the poor. And that didn't work out. So then they said, well, capitalism is subject to periodic crises. Well, that didn't work out either. Then they said capitalism is corrupting of the soul. And that didn't work out. Now they're saying the problem with capitalism is the environment. And I sincerely ask my left-wing friends, which is it? Is it that you just don't like capitalism regardless of whether it's good or bad? That you just keep looking for an argument against it regardless? And if that's the case, then I really do ask you in the bowels of Christ to consider whether you'd be mistaken. The worst thing we can do for the wretched of the earth is to kill off economic growth. If we do that, if we in the West, in our superior way, say, oh no, you people, you're spoiling the environment, and it's terribly vulgar, and we're gonna, I don't know how we're gonna do it, but suppose we could just turn the switch and stop economic growth in the poor countries of the world. If in our arrogance we pull that switch because of our worries about the corruptions of capitalism or environmental worry, that would be the worst sin in human history. Because the poor of the world have within their grasp a life like you all have. It would be a disaster. Besides being foolish for ourselves, because the prosperity of the rest of the world is not a zero-sum game. If they do better, if China and India grow, this is going to be better for all of us. It's not competitiveness, that silly non-economic way of talking that politicians engage in. So I urge you to see how serious this matter is. To ask yourself, isn't it possible that we're on the right track instead of the wrong track? And to go home and be cheerful. As we say these days, have a nice rest of the evening.
Well, on that note, I think we should end it here. So thank you very much. As a reminder, if you could fill out the surveys, that would be great.
Yeah, please do fill out the surveys, because the Nebraska Humanities Council will not give you any more money if it thinks people don't care.
That's right. That's right. And then, of course,
about my talk, fill it out.
And then, of course, April 10th.
First talk I've ever heard. She's a fascist. Send her to jail. That's okay. I don't mind.
And then on April 10, Imre Seeman will be talking about the politics of oil, including, I'm sure, the pipeline and all that kind of stuff. So that would have been, like a perfect, or that was a perfect segue for our last talk. Okay.